The topic is more important and urgent than ever before. So we focus on the human side of digital transformation. There's so much buzz around AI and robots and taking over the world and everybody losing their job, but that's not exactly the case. And at the same time, transformation and change are constant, but most of them, that's the problem with that. So three things are important. Measure what matters, optimize what works, prove what changed. So these sound really simple, but if you really think about it, HR people, L&D professionals, and consultants really struggle with all three of them. And by the end of this session, hopefully, we are going to have much more insights. So just visualize this. 2004, Christmas, and a British family is spending Christmas on the beach in Thailand. There's a little girl, 10 years old, and she says, something is wrong. Look at the sea. I think there's going to be a tsunami. And the parents just didn't believe her at all. But luckily, there was a Japanese person there who spoke English and who said, I heard that there was an earthquake somewhere near. And as it turned out, it was true. So quickly, they evacuated the beach, and then tsunami hit. That is still missed. 2 weeks prior to the holiday, she learned about the tsunami and she recognized all the signs. First, they didn't believe her. Then they did, and then she saved more than 100 people. Unfortunately, more than 200,000 people died within a few days. All the signs were there, but somehow they were ignored. So imagine if you see that. And in a way, that's exactly what's happening in our field as well. We have a lot of HR professionals here, and that's exactly the challenge. That the workforce is burning out. The burnout rate is up. Engagement is plummeting, and the managers are getting disengaged. This is the sharpest fall on record. They're spending insane amount of money on people solutions, but the results are getting worse. 70% of digital, cultural, AI, and organizational transformations fail. And they're costing companies an average of 5 to 50 million pounds per initiative. So it costs a lot of money. It's getting worse and worse. That is the challenge with it. But I don't know if you remember this case study when Bolt fired a lot of people, all the HR people. Do you remember that? Because they created more problems than solutions. This happened in May. So it sounds interesting, but it's not the full truth, unfortunately. Because let's be honest, HR function is critical, but often it is seen as an admin function, not as a strategic business partner. That's one of the main challenges. And one of the main reasons is that often the success is invisible. If everything goes well, then obviously it's easy. Come on, it's just admin. If something goes wrong, then they blame HR, and that is not right. So in the last few weeks, I was talking to 15 different HR leaders, and there was one overarching theme, and that was that they had insane pressure to implement AI, increase performance, but they were lacking the solution to address the reason why over 70% of transformations fail or provide negative ROI. That's not a good position to be in at all. And we have to change that. And sometimes the problem is that we are measuring the wrong things. Everything looks perfect, but the patient dies. You can see that measuring engagement scores, how many training hours they had, the amount of people who completed the course. But then psychological safety, inclusion collapses, and the transformation fails. Everything looks healthy. Yes, if you measure the wrong thing and you get the wrong result, that's the problem with that. But it shouldn't be like that, because there are 9 biomarkers within the 3 invisible forces behind every high-performing leadership team and transformation, and they are measurable with the same discipline as finance or operations. So here's the question: how can we make this role more relevant? How we can prove what changed? How we can link it to ROI? Because if you do a good job, that's fantastic, but how do we prove it if success is invisible? And this is what I would like to show you. Because if we get it right and we apply this data-driven leadership team and culture development, then we can do that. So the whole presentation is about this. I want to show you in a practical way how it can be done. This is a Fortune 500 company, global leadership team. They're not doing really well. No psychological safety, no motivation, but they're leading thousands of people and they invest a lot of money in the project. 6 months later, this is where they were. All the biomarkers improved, and there's a little bit of tension there. So I'm going to show you exactly what this means and why it matters and why it's relevant to our topic. My name is Csaba. I'm the founder of ICQ Global, and we have more than 250 partners in over 50 countries who can apply the same methodology. So this is about creating high-performing teams, optimizing what works. We have to go beyond guessing and hoping, because if the future of the company depends on our decision, and guessing is not an option, it has to be data-driven. And sometimes that's the challenge. It's not just a good idea. We work with hundreds of companies. We scan more than 900 global leadership teams, and there is a clear pattern. What can go wrong and which levers we need to pull to get better results. The process is challenging sometimes. It's not always pleasant, but failure is much worse. Let's be honest. Here's an example. This is the dashboard of our car, an SUV. One day I saw this sign and I thought, battery is low. So let's Google it quickly. Let me charge it because I know that. So I charged it immediately all night. Next day, it's even lower. Something is not right. So I called my brother who said that you have two batteries. I said, no, really. That you cannot charge this one? Not really. So my point is that I put a lot of effort into something that didn't make sense. Intention is great. Result is not. And that's exactly what's happening in the leadership field as well. MIT Sloan Management Review wanted to understand why most programs deliver negative ROI. And the result was that often the problem is that they make a decision based on the packaging and nobody measures the impact on the people who matter the most, the team. They are evaluated based on how informative or entertaining they were. But we are not in the entertainment business. It has to be valuable, not entertaining. The other challenge is that often companies use outdated and disconnected solutions. So most of the solutions that we are using today, the really popular ones, were created in the 50s and 60s. They were created by people who were born just after the American Civil War in the 19th century. That time there was no internet, no hybrid working environment, no cheap flights, no EU. If you look at this chart, for example, even just before 1975, less than 17% of the value was created by humans. They were seen as a cost to contain, but today it's more than 90% is created by humans. The world completely changed, but not the solutions we are using. And it's a no-brainer to understand that new challenges require new solutions, not the ones that were designed for the life in the 50s and 60s. We can see the result of that. Just because something is popular or looks familiar doesn't mean that it still works, because the circumstances change. It's almost like trying to fix a smart TV with tools designed for black and white ones. You can try it harder, but it's different. But the third reason is really interesting. Giving people what they want instead of what they need. And as HR people or consultants, that's exactly our challenge, because a lot of money is spent on well-being and engagement programs. But according to research, when they analyzed 90 different interventions, only one had a slightly positive impact. Only one. And that is volunteer work. Yes, you can give people a yoga class or free lunch, but again, that's the entertainment category. It has nothing to do with engagement. I'm not saying it's not needed, it's just not engagement. But the problem is that some programs energize people, but it doesn't mean it's valuable. And growth mindset is one of those examples. People love attending those courses. They finish and they think, yep, I've got growth mindset, I'm good. But even according to Carol Dweck, who coined that term, that's not exactly true, because you can have off the chart growth mindset. If your environment is not psychologically safe, it's not nurturing, it's not inclusive, it has zero benefits. It means nothing. The environment is really important. So here's the question: how do you create the right environment where growth, engagement, and profit are pretty much inevitable? And I want to show you this through the 3 different case studies. Having worked with a financial institution, they're going through a digital transformation, but they were smart enough to check if the people were ready for it. Because change management is very popular. Everything looks fantastic and logical on paper, but let's be honest, companies don't transform. People do, if it makes sense to them. So if they are not ready, then they are going to fail. So change leadership is the gap in the market that we have to fill. The human side of digital transformation. I'm going to show you an example where engagement went up by 400% compared to any other previous programs in a Fortune 200 company. And why, for example, a bank decided to certify their in-house L&D and HR people to roll out the solutions. Why that is the scalable and sustainable solution. So here's a tricky question. What is the lead indicator and precursor of quality decision making responsible for 95% of business performance? What would you say? If you put it in the chat, what do you think? What is the number one lead indicator? Even as a leader, it would make sense to know the answer. Engagement, it is definitely part of it, but that also requires something. Jessica, yes, that's exactly what the research shows. Psychological safety, responsible for 95% of business performance. And yet when you ask leaders, where is your team on psychological safety? 99% of them cannot answer that question. Where was your team before you invest in a program? And where was your team after that? No idea. Would it make sense? Psychological safety is not a new thing. In 1788, when they introduced the Chimney Sweeper Act in the UK, they did that because they realized that the employer has a duty of care. And they realized that the minimum age to become a chimney sweeper apprentice was 4 years old, People got really upset, and that had to change. So it took maybe 250 years, and now you have the same health and safety standards in most countries. But recently, they added one more, the psychosocial, one more category, because they realized that an attack on your psychological safety can cause more damage than a broken bone. But how do you optimize it, and how do we prove it? That's the question. Later on, Google came up with an idea. Let's find out the secret of high-performing teams. First assumption, we don't need leaders. As it turned out, that was a bad one, because you need leaders. You need really good leaders who create psychological safety, which is the number one trait of high-performing teams. It's that important. It has nothing to do with being nice to people or being polite. The higher it goes, the better the performance is. It's proven beyond doubt. It's that important. Lots of people talk about that, but when you ask them, how do you measure it so you can optimize it? Often there is silence. And as HR people and coaches and consultants, that's something we need to be able to do. So we can stay relevant and we can help the clients. So we can prove what changed. But on its own, it's not enough. You also need motivation, the desire to get things done. And there are different versions how you can motivate people. At the end of the day, you cannot because they motivate themselves. But Daniel Pink had a really interesting take on it. He talks about the evolution of motivation. 1.0, really primal. Make babies, survive. Motivation 2.0 is the pain and pleasure principle, the carrot and the stick, extrinsic motivators, which worked, especially in the industrial age. You pay people more, they work harder, or you punish them. But the problem is that we get used to everything. And also what the research shows is that when it comes to creativity, white-collar jobs, strategy, it's not that it doesn't work, but it actually backfires. The performance gets worse. If you really want to increase it, you have to tap into intrinsic motivators. These are the ones that are coming from inside. But for that, you have to know people. You have to get to know them. Just like Chris Voss, the FBI hostage negotiator, said, there's no such thing as logical, only what matters to someone. So once you understand that, you can create the environment where people motivate themselves. And here's an example. If you score high on both, you are in the growth zone. It's a wonderful place. If you score low on both, apathy, horrible. If you have only psychological safety, it's comfortable, but nothing grows there. Anxiety is when there's motivation, but not a lot of safety. But as soon as you can quantify it, it becomes real, not just a subjective opinion. So you can see that as a team, this big donut, that's the team average, which is great. But we know that numbers can lie or they can hide the truth. So as a team, it's great. But if you look at the tension score and the individual dots, you realize that within the same environment, people feel vastly differently. So how is it possible that within the same environment, under the same leadership, some people are like fish in the water and others feel rejected and demotivated? What is the reason? To be honest, we have no idea usually because we have only the data, but people have the insights. So we measure it and then we discuss it because people cannot talk about something they are not aware of. So you have to give people the framework, the vocabulary to create meaningful conversations driven by data and rooted in science. And here's a bad example. So we had a client in Scandinavia, oil and gas company. And the team, the leadership team, including the CEO, was in the apathy zone. During our program, one of the refineries burned down because unfortunately, the level of psychological safety was also reflected in the level of health and safety. It wasn't consistent. And that's not a good idea in that industry. But on the other side, a big mining company, the biggest one in Indonesia, they had 17 accidents a week, according to them. And 6 months later, they had 0. Indeed, they won the most prestigious awards in that category. They turned psychological safety into physical safety. It is that important. That's business performance. But there's a third invisible force, and that is cognitive diversity. I'm pretty sure that you heard about diversity and inclusion, the field, but often they focus on the superficial layer, the identity differences. Cognitive diversity is the only layer that has proven benefit in terms of performance. That's why it's called the immune system of a team. The way people think, the way they make a decision, the way they process information, the way they see the world. On paper, it sounds great. In reality, it's very uncomfortable. When two people disagree, that's exactly where the potential lies for success or disaster. The benefits of diversity are not automatic. You need a blueprint to unlock it. So imagine that you have Emma. She's the leader, very smart. She can see things. And then she employs really smart people. But she's unaware of one of the strongest forces in team dynamics. And that is homophilic diversity. It sounds like a disease, but it just means that we like and trust people who are similar to us, people who have common sense. So that means that a team can be individually really smart, but collectively blind. because they have a huge blind spot. Here's an example. 10 senior leaders from 8 different countries, seemingly really diverse. But when they completed the assessment, it turned out cognitive diversity was 22%. So if you look at the sliding scales as a range of perspective, object, for example, approaches to problems and opportunities, then everybody, all the 10 people from 8 different countries are within the same range. That's scary, yet logical. Why would you employ somebody who annoys you, somebody who disagrees with you? We don't need that hassle. We have enough. Well, yes, you can have a meeting. Everybody agrees. It feels right, but it doesn't make it true because we have a huge blind spot. Sometimes the clarity of the decision or the clarity of the vision comes from the tunnel vision rather than the quality and quantity of information. And that can be slightly misleading. So technically, there are 2 main approaches to this, to understanding people. One is the intercultural solutions. They talk about what is normal and expected in a country. You can see that on LinkedIn when you can see the different charts and they say, now I understand German people. That's not exactly true because more than 80% of cultural differences exist within countries, not between them. We all belong to 15 or 20 different culture groups at the same time. That's the country of origin, gender, generation, hobby, profession, a lot of different things. So imagine that you talk to someone even in your own family. What are the chances that they belong to the same 15 or 20 culture groups like you? It's pretty much zero. Every single conversation is a cross-cultural dialogue. Every single team is multicultural, even if it's not international. But to make it more exciting, the poorest container of culture, according to research, is country of origin, gender, and generation. Meaning that based on these categories, you cannot predict an individual's values and beliefs. It has nothing to do with science. So international knowledge has not much to do with cultural intelligence. And here's an example. We had a team of leaders. Everybody grew up in Jakarta, in Indonesia. Everybody. Seemingly very homogeneous. But as you can see, the individuals, there's a widespread. Barely anyone is statistically average. So that's the problem with that. We learn how to interact with different nationalities, but chances are that people are not like that, not the individuals, especially online, especially in a hybrid environment. That's exactly what we noticed during COVID as well. Here's another example. This is a big German company. They employed a lot of Brazilian engineers, and we had to create a high-performing team. So we can start with the country-specific approach. Of course, there are big differences. But when we looked at the results, it turned out that the Brazilian engineers were much more German inside than most Germans. And that's fantastic. So instead of pointing out statistically average national differences that do not apply on an individual level to widen the gap, we created a common ground. They realized that for them, at least on a cognitive level, it was the right environment. The country and the profession as well. They even left Brazil because it was too messy and disorganized for them. But that also makes sense because you don't choose your gender, generation, or country of origin. But even if you are completely different, you learn how to navigate efficiently in that environment. Culture is not who we are, it's what we are used to. Yes, it shapes us, but it's not the same thing. That's why we cannot ignore it. And this is where the second approach becomes important. Psychometric assessments, personality types. And there are a lot of different types, and some people are really passionate about some of them. But here's an example. Let's say that you profile this sunflower and everything about it, which is great. It's a good starting point. But where do you put it? In the snow? In the desert? In the middle of the jungle? Or in the right environment? Depending on where you put it, you get very different results. Your personality determines how you want to behave, but culture determines how you have to behave. That's the point. And this is really important. Once you take the assessment, then we can learn about what you do, how, and most importantly, why. Because 95% of our actions are driven by values and beliefs you're not even aware of. And we think that we are objective and logical. That's just not true. But once this is done, we are not going to use it as an excuse to I'm green, you are blue, case closed, because then we just made it worse. But we use it as a starting point because everything is relative. So we can measure the mindset gap between you and your environment. If you are brave enough, you can do it with your partner. Between 2 people, it's the same idea. Or we can have a look at the leader and the team average. Everything is relative. This is when leaders understand how come they have the best intention. They really want to motivate people, but somehow it backfires. And that's why guessing is not important. So going back to Emma, she's still the leader, but now she knows about the topic. So now she employs people who are really smart, but also different. And now they can see the same situation from different perspectives so they can make better decisions. That's the goal. But this is difficult. Based on how they score on the three invisible forces, they can be in 4 stages of growth. Growth zone is when they score high on all 3 of them. Time bomb is when they have a problem with one. It's called time bomb because if you find it, you can diffuse it. If you don't, there's going to be a problem. Stage 3 is decline, when you have a problem with 2. And stage 4 is pretty much game over, when you score low on all 3 of them. Everybody thinks the same way. Nobody feels safe. Nobody is motivated. We know exactly where it leads to. And that's the question to the leaders as well. Where is your team? And how do you, that's the real question. And this is why we have to focus on the human side of digital transformation. Because I'm pretty sure that if you look at this drawing, it feels familiar. The problem is crystal clear. The solution is crystal clear, but you have a lot of people with different opinions. And it's a mess. And this is what happens in companies. That's why a lot of transformations fail. So when we work with this company, we measure the biomarkers, and 4 of them were not ideal. But we have to understand that transformation is also a curve. So 6 months later, this is where they were. So once we can visualize it, it's much easier to manage. People can make an informed decision. It's not going to create more problems. It's more like when you're in a dark room and you bump into everything. It's not pleasant. When you switch on the lights, at least you can see everything and you can make better decisions. It doesn't create more problems. It makes them more visible. Because if they are visible, you can deal with them. Otherwise, they're just brewing beneath the surface. So this is exactly where they are now. They have to make a decision which way they want to go, downhill or out of the curve. This was a Fortune 200 company. They merged 3 different departments and we had to create a high-performing team. There was no identity, no synergy. It was really interesting. 6 months later, they did really well. Engagement went up by 400% compared to previous programs. Once you understand why you do what you do, and you understand the blueprint of why people think and behave differently, how they can complement you, then you can create a high-performing team. Without it, it's very difficult. And let's be honest, the smarter the people are, the more difficult it is. Smart individuals rarely excel as a team by themselves. They need a blueprint. But there's, for example, a bank in the Netherlands. They decided to certify 10 people within the company, and they want to roll it out internally. Their logic is that they want to reduce dependency on external consultants. They want to have the relevant data, the biomarkers that actually matter, because you can measure how happy people are or how many people complete the course, but as you can see it, that's not the right thing. So how do you make it more scalable and sustainable? That was their reasoning. And it's not even about investing in something new, but replacing something that doesn't work anymore, something that doesn't provide the benefits that you are hoping and paying for. So the interesting thing is that we scanned more than 900 leadership teams in 50 countries. And it was really interesting how there was a pattern, 6 behaviors that can ruin a company. So if you look at the biomarkers, one was that they suppress psychological safety. That is the number one. In that case, courage is gone, inclusivity, people don't feel valued. Micromanagement over trust. So people lose motivation really quickly because I can feel that if I control them, then it's going to be good. Favoritism. So we don't have equal rights. You have to be nice to the leader. You have more rights. If you contradict, there's a problem. But that's exactly where the potential lies. That's why it's difficult. Undermining growth and development. This is what we can do under pressure. Usually companies cut growth and development opportunities. Why would they need support? They are going through transformation. They are suffering. So let's take that away from them. How does that make sense? What in a way it does, because so far they haven't really seen the result, or at least the results were not quantified. Often they have the evaluation that everybody loved the workshop. Great, but is that a result? Not really. Results are measurable and transparent. If they are not, then they are not results. It has to be valuable. We have to prove our value. We have to prove that something works in a relevant way. So it's nice to talk about people, but at the end of the day, companies need to make money. So we don't have to choose between people and money. This is the bridge. And also short-term gains as priority. This is when they make a lot of mistakes, when they push the boundaries and they lose that motivation. And poor communication. That's one of the main issues. Because if people don't have enough information, then they fill in the gaps. And those assumptions tend to be negative. And that's when it goes wrong. Plus, they are going to discuss it with people like themselves, so they hear it from different sources, which means it's true because I heard it from other people. So that's the challenge here, because also I read a case study about the dam, which is, I don't know, it was weird, but I found it really interesting because there's a parallel to entrepreneurship as well, because it takes a lot of time for the cracks to appear. But once you see them, the collapse is very close. Like one of the entrepreneurs said that when they asked him, how did you go into bankruptcy? And he said, first slowly and then really quickly. And it's the same idea. For example, Salesforce had a really interesting research. They asked CEOs about their customer service, and 80% of them said, oh, we have outstanding customer service. But then they looked at the results, only 8% of customers agreed with them. 8%. But the funny part is that 91% of people would say nothing. So there's no direct feedback that something is wrong. They just leave. They have plenty of options. And that's exactly the problem. That often the feedback is in silence. So would it make sense to measure it? Because maybe you measure something and it looks healthy, but the patient dies.